It's Monday. You know what that means. We're playing the blues. Now that song will make your hound dog howl. That is some serious blues. Well, I'm feeling pretty perky today, and I'm not really singing the blues. I'm going to talk about some things on my mind. We're going to start with the daily text, and it is taken from Acts 20:24. It's, by the way, February 25. The scripture text is, "If only I may finish my course and the ministry." And that was when the Apostle Paul was on the beach with the elders, telling them that they wouldn't see his face again. And he was encouraging them to be vigilant and strong and watchful. Anyway, the Watchtower's comment is interesting. It says, "If we treasure our ministry, we will be like the Apostle Paul, continuing to preach despite persecution." During the 1930s and early 1940s, our brothers in the United States faced tremendous opposition. Yet, like Paul, they stood firm and continued preaching. To protect our right to do that, the brothers fought many legal battles. In 1943, Brother Nathan H. Knorr, when commenting on one victory in the U.S. Supreme Court, stated, "The victories won are due to our fight. It is this victory of the Lord's people standing firm that finally brings that decision." Yes, our love for the ministry can defeat persecution. When we view the ministry as a priceless treasure from Jehovah, we will never be content with simply counting time. Rather, we will do everything in our power to bear thorough witness to the good news. I heartily concur with the Watchtower's impetus on having a ministry. Some have asked me, well, do you go door to door and preach? No, I do not. I used to, and I used to be fairly zealous. I pioneered off and on and conducted home Bible studies, probably with over 100 people during my time as one of Jehovah's Witnesses. Now I have what I would call an internet ministry, and ironically, I have greater freeness of speech now, and I have a much larger audience. That's my ministry. But I still support the ministry of Jehovah's Witnesses. And I believe that that work is sponsored by Jehovah and is used by Christ to accomplish what he said. This good news of the kingdom will be preached in all the world, and then the end will come. The end of the preaching, that is, the end of the ministry, the end of what is called today. There's an expression in one of Peter's letters, I think it's his first letter, where he refers to until the day of eternity. Let that sink in. The day of eternity. That's when the kingdom comes. And everyone's eternal fate will be decided, whether it's going into a new world or being cut off, terminated. So yes, I encourage everyone to have a ministry. The Watchtower even has a provision for unbaptized publishers. And I encourage you, even if you have issues with the Watchtower and all that, set that aside and, get your feet wet. And that's where the action is, in the ministry, engaging with people, trying to reason with them. And, that's where people are lacking, I feel, in my experience and dealings with people. People lack the ability to reason properly. They come to wrong conclusions far more often than they otherwise. So we want to develop the ability to reason honestly. Jesus said that one of the sins was wicked reasonings. So we want to reason honestly upon, you have to know a little bit about the truth to reason upon it, right? So, we need knowledge, but we need to apply that knowledge correctly and develop, our minds. Using our minds is like using our muscles. And the more you use your muscle, like, you're lifting weights or some kind of strenuous activity, you build up your muscle. Well, we can build up our minds and develop our reasoning ability. Well, Jehovah's Witnesses can use some help in that regard as well, in reasoning. Now let's break down what the society is saying here. It is true that Jehovah's Witnesses have won many legal battles. In fact, I'm looking at a web page right now on historynet.com, and the title of this article is "What We Owe Jehovah's Witnesses," and the subheading is "Jehovah's Witnesses Were Unlikely Champions of Religious Freedom." There were two primary issues that Jehovah's Witnesses got into legal trouble over, and one was, of course, over mandatory draft. But that wasn't really an issue until the United States was drug into the war in 1941 when the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor, and then the draft was instituted. Most men didn't have to be drafted. I mean, they willingly volunteered. Their nation was at war. They had been attacked. But Jehovah's Witnesses took the stand that they were ministers and conscientious objectors, and the government did not afford them exemption. And many of the brothers in the United States of draft age went to prison. Most of them, I think, went to prison in Kansas, Leavenworth Federal Prison. It's funny because it was Leavenworth at that time. It was called the Second Bethel. And the brothers there, they were allowed to carry on their meetings, and they had so much time on their hand. They went into deep Bible study. And after the war, when they came out of the Second Bethel, many of these brothers became pioneers and circuit overseers and missionaries. So it was really a provision, you might say, from Jehovah to train these brothers. He saved them from being put in the front lines in the war, and he used that to train them to be better ministers. Well, anyway, the other issue, other than mandatory military service, was the flag salute. And children were being expelled from school, and the Supreme Court took up this case, and it ruled in favor of Jehovah's Witnesses. And it is true what Rutherford said. Jehovah's Witnesses kept fighting. They didn't compromise. Their children didn't start saluting the flag and pledging allegiance, and their brothers were resolute. They were not going to take up arms and kill their fellow man. And Jehovah gave them the victory. Here's the other issue, though. The United States government was not really persecuting Jehovah's Witnesses. It was, in fact, their protector. You know, the real persecution of Jehovah's Witnesses was coming from the Catholic Church during the 30s, because Judge Rutherford had really antagonized them to such an extent with his vitriol denunciation of them over the radio. I mean, he was the most prominent voice on the radio in the 1930s. And, you know, they had these sound cars going around, people with these megaphones and sandwich signs, religion is a racket and a snare. And it really stirred up a hornet's nest of animosity. And they intended to provoke a reaction. And that's fine. I think that was an effective ploy. But when this wave of persecution came and became more and more intense, the United States government became their protector. The First Lady at the time, Eleanor Roosevelt, spoke out in behalf of Jehovah's Witnesses. So let's don't assume that there was persecution, yes, but it wasn't coming really from the highest level of government. Local towns were prosecuting Jehovah's Witnesses, and state courts were prosecuting Jehovah's Witnesses. The Supreme Court gave Jehovah's Witnesses, they must have given them a dozen victories. You know, years later, law students were studying these Supreme Court rulings in behalf of Jehovah's Witnesses. Well, where am I going with this? Well, Bible prophecy. As you know, that's really my focus. And I've dissected the Watchtower's teaching on prophecy. I've studied the prophets for a long time. But let's take the 8th chapter of Daniel about the little horn that ascends, and it persecutes the princes, even the prince of princes, and it desolates the holy place. And it keeps throwing truth to the earth. Well, the Watchtower teaches that this took place during World War II, that the Anglo-American duo is this little horn that desolates this holy place and removes the constant feature. Now, I'd like to read to you an excerpt from the Watchtower's Pay Attention to Daniel's Prophecy on the chapter regarding who can stand against the Prince of Princes. And it quotes the passage at Daniel 8, 11, and 12. From him, the constant feature was taken away, and the established place of his sanctuary was thrown down, and an army itself was gradually given over together with the constant feature because of transgression, and it kept throwing truth to the earth, and it acted and had success. Well, they asked the question, how was this fulfilled? What was the experience of Jehovah's Witnesses during World War II? They suffered intense persecution. It started in Nazi and fascist countries, but soon truth was being thrown to the earth throughout the vast domain of the small horn whose power had become mighty. The army of kingdom proclaimers and their work of preaching the good news were banned in almost all of the British Commonwealth. When these nations conscripted their manpower, they refused to grant ministerial exemption to Jehovah's Witnesses, showing no respect for their theocratic appointment as ministers of God. Mob violence and various indignities were experienced by Jehovah's faithful servants in the United States. Now, take particular note of this next sentence. The seventh world power, in effect, tried to take away a sacrifice, the fruit of lips, regularly offered to Jehovah by his people as the constant feature of their worship. The world power thus committed the transgression of invading the rightful domain of the Most High God, the established place of his sanctuary. Okay, did you get that? The seventh world power tried to take away a sacrifice of praise. The prophecy doesn't say that the little horn tried. It says he acted and had success. He threw down the place of God's sanctuary. He dragged down the stars of heaven. So his persecution was or will be successful. Now, the Watchtower has to use a sleight of hand. You know, it's like someone who does card tricks, right? And you've seen, these guys are very adroit and masters of using their hands to make you think you see something, and then you see something that you didn't expect. Well, this is what I call a sleight of hand, because the Watchtower well knows that the United States government did not curtail the work of Jehovah's Witnesses. They actually defended them from this mob violence. It's all true what the Watchtower says. Jehovah's Witnesses experienced the indignities of mob violence. I'm going to restate it at the risk of being repetitive. The United States government was not their persecutor. It was their defender. And it did not suppress the work of the Watchtower. The work of Jehovah's Witnesses went on. The Watchtower never missed an issue, nor did it in World War I. And the Watchtower has interpreted a whole range of prophecies to that war. And, the point is, the Watchtower's interpretation of all prophecy, virtually all prophecy, having to do with the coming of the kingdom, it is fraudulent because Christ did not come in 1914. That's why they have to do all these gymnastics, because they're dedicated to this delusion that Christ has already come. Whereas my perspective is, and I know I'm right, these prophecies have a future fulfillment. The little horn is not the Anglo-American dual world power. The little horn proceeds from them, and it is the eighth king. It will come into existence after the crash of the present ruling system. And that's when the persecution of Jehovah's Witnesses will begin in earnest, and the work will be shut down, and Jehovah's Witnesses will be trampled upon, and until they learn some humility. And then Christ steps in as the greater Cyrus, as their liberator, and reinvigorates them. And there'll be a short work of 3.5 years when the final witness is given. And then this fierce-looking king, spoken about in this 8th chapter of Daniel, will be crushed. Speaking on the people not being able to reason properly, someone left a comment on a video of mine a few hours ago, the video, The Collapse of the Watchtower, that I did a few months back. He says, "Robert King, you're contradicting yourself. Either the Watchtower Society is the true religion or false religion. Which one? You sound just as confused as the Jehovah's Witnesses. You have an ulterior motive to have the ex-Jehovah's Witnesses follow you instead of the Watchtower Society. If it is not based upon or centered around Christ Jesus, it is not of God. He speaks about Jehovah instead of Jesus. He's a false prophet, folks. Where do you begin with that? No, but this idea that either the Watchtower is a true religion or a false religion, it can't be both. And this person obviously is not one of Jehovah's Witnesses. And why would I want ex-Jehovah's Witnesses to follow me instead of the Watchtower? The ex-Jehovah's Witnesses don't follow the Watchtower. So he's mixed up. But this business at the Watchtower has to be black or white. People that make these comments or believe this really don't know what they're talking about. And they don't know the scriptures, do they? Take, for example, Israel. Was Israel God's possession? Was it his nation? Yes. Did he destroy them? Yes. How about Judah, Jerusalem? Was that the place where God put his name? Were they in a covenant with God? Yes, yes, yes. Did God destroy them? Again, yes. The time of Jesus, he referred to Jerusalem as the holy city, respected the temple as God's house. He cleansed the temple of the money changers, and yet he foretold that not a stone would be left upon a stone. It was going to be destroyed. So was Jerusalem God's possession or wasn't it? Was it true religion or false religion? Which was it? Got to be one or the other. Well, let's put it this way. It fulfilled God's purpose. It produced the Messiah, and it readied the Jews to become his followers. And many thousands did, and they were given entry into the kingdom because of their faith. But they had to transition from Judaism to Christianity, and that wasn't easy for many of them. So you have to use your reasoning, and you have to have a little bit of knowledge. And Jehovah's Witnesses, or let's say the Watchtower today, is in the same position as the Jewish system in the time of Christ. It has readied a people. It has served God's purpose up to a point. But with the second coming of Jesus, it will have served its purpose. And then people of faith will have to make a transition. Wasn't the central feature of Jesus' discussion about the sign of his coming, the conclusion? The main feature of his discussion was the city of Jerusalem being surrounded by enemies, the holy place being trampled upon, and that Christians would have to make a life and death decision to leave what prior to that time had been perceived by them as something holy. And going back to the 8th chapter, isn't that what Daniel is referring to? God's holy place being trampled? It's what it says. Uses that exact same expression. And yet the Watchtower teaches this already took place back during World War II, even though, obviously, the holy place being trampled upon, according to Jesus, occurs during the Great Tribulation. Are there two holy places that get trampled upon at two different times? Well, why did Jesus say, let the reader use discernment? See the prophecy of Daniel. What was he talking about? You, the reader, have to use discernment. You have to use your reasoning. But it's right there. Well, why didn't the Watchtower get it? It has something to do with what Isaiah said, that Jehovah has covered the heads of his prophets. Well, we'd mentioned Judge Rutherford. I'd like to read to you an article that I'd written some years back, 2014. It's a mailbag question someone had asked. He said, I've done a lot of research about Judge Rutherford online. I'm well aware that you can't always believe everything you come across. With that in mind, it seems he had a lot of issues. Over drinking, He didn't live with his wife for over 20 years while president of the Watchtower. There's quite a list of things online. I could write a book on the things he's done wrong. In fact, I think someone has. I'm sure you've heard about these things. My question is, how could Jesus have been happy with his service and allow this to happen? He even manhandled brothers in charge so he could take control and had them called the evil slave. Okay, well, here's my comment. To put things in perspective, everyone who is an outspoken advocate of the truth or who goes against the prevailing orthodoxy will inevitably create a lot of enemies. Keep in mind that Jesus was slandered as being a glutton and given to drinking wine and a friend of the despised tax collectors. Paul was also slandered by the superfine apostles in Corinth. They defamed him as having a weak personal presence and being a contemptible public speaker. Even to this day, Jesus and Paul continue to be slandered. For example, Jesus is accused of having been a homosexual, and Paul is denounced by some as the Antichrist. It should come as no surprise that C.T. Russell and J.F. Rutherford have come in for the same slander treatment, the purpose being to discredit the message. Judge Rutherford was cast to the fore as the president of the Watchtower Society during a very turbulent time. Europe had already been plunged into war, and then C.T. Russell unexpectedly died. A power struggle immediately erupted among certain leading men at Bethel. But during that upheaval, Rutherford and 7 others were railroaded off to prison on trumped-up charges of sedition. That experience seems to have galvanized Rutherford as a fighter. And after his release from the Atlanta penitentiary, he went on an offensive against the clergy, particularly the Catholic Church. I liken his vitriol against the clergy to Samson when he lit fires to the tails of dozens of foxes, sending them through the standing grain fields of the Philistines. He was intending to provoke a reaction. But the judge also had to deal with the cult-like following that Russell retained in the organization, even after his death. Rutherford jettisoned a lot of the baggage left over from the Russell era, like the celebration of Christmas and Easter. He ditched the Masonic cross and crown. He repudiated Russell's pyramidology. He was completely different in personality than his kindly-mannered predecessor. Did Rutherford have issues? And no doubt. Was he brusque and overbearing? Probably so. Did he like the booze, even during Prohibition? Apparently. Was he responsible for demonizing any who opposed him? He was a lawyer, wasn't he? Did he have marital problems? Everyone who has a mate does. So why should Rutherford be any different? But despite his personal flaws, he brought Jehovah's Witnesses into the spotlight on the world stage. His books, like Enemies, were very powerful exposés of false religion. Rutherford's boldness and outspokenness seems to be what the Bible students and Jehovah's Witnesses needed at the time to brace themselves for the persecution that came upon them in Nazi Germany and in America and throughout the English-speaking world. His combative nature emboldened Jehovah's Witnesses to defy Hitler and stand up to wave after wave of persecution in the United States. Taking the broader view, it appears that Joseph Franklin Rutherford was well suited for the times in which he lived. When it comes to judging individuals, even in post-mortem retrospect, we do well to consider the question Paul posed to the brothers in his letter to the Romans. Quote, "Who are you to judge the servant of another? To his own master he stands or falls. Indeed, he will be made to stand, for Jehovah can make him stand. Paul also wrote to the Corinthians on the matter of judging, saying, "A man should regard us as attendants of Christ and stewards of God's sacred secrets. In this regard, what is expected of stewards is that they be found faithful." Now, to me, it is of very little importance to be examined by you or by a human tribunal. In fact, I do not even examine myself, for I am not conscious of anything against myself. But by this I am not proved righteous. The one who examines me is Jehovah. Therefore, do not judge anything before the due time, until the Lord comes. He will bring the secret things of darkness to light and make known the intentions of the hearts, and then each one will receive his praise from God. End of article. Well, that's an interesting expression there. Do not judge anything before its due time until the Lord comes. Did the Lord come in 1914? Obviously not, because the secret things of darkness have not come to light yet. So, we can't judge individuals like Russell and Rutherford or anyone. Now, some will say, well, you criticize and judge the governing body. Well, not as individuals. I judge what they teach, what they hold up as truth, not them personally, not what they do in their, I leave that to God. But when I'm asked to believe something as having come from God, then isn't it our obligation to determine if it's true or not? The Watchtower says everything that comes from the slave is straight from the mouth of God. But the scripture says, test every inspired utterance to really see if it originates with God, because many false prophets have gone forth into the world. That person whose comment I read, he said that I speak about Jehovah instead of Jesus, therefore I'm a false prophet, which is, of course, ridiculous. But when it comes to false prophecy, the Christian apostle Peter said that just as there were false prophets among the people, referring to ancient times, so there will be false teachers among you, and that these will quietly bring in destructive sects. So it isn't a case of the false teachers being on the outside, like the clergy. The apostle of Christ foretold that false teachers will be among you. He didn't say they might be. He said they will be. So, I've exposed the false teaching of 1914 for a long, long time. It doesn't mean that Jehovah's Witnesses are a false religion. It means that they are victimized by false teachers. Those whom it says of in the 13th chapter of Ezekiel that they're stupid prophets. Well, anyway, I always have more to say on that topic, but I shall leave it for a future broadcast. And so let me leave you with some more blues, singing the blues about a good world gone bad.
you.